Hey everybody, I'm just going to talk about um, getting started with your home network. So let's say you're kind of like, you're deciding what you want to do, and you're not really sure, you're not really sure how to get started with a home network. First things first, you're going to have your ISP. This is going to depend a lot on your area. Some ISPs are better than others. And if you don't know, ISP just stands for Internet Service Provider. So that's going to be like it's going to be, your Verizon, your Xfinity, um, your Spectrum. I don't know if Cox is still a thing. I think it is. But depending on your area and depending on, if you're in an apartment or a house, you're going to have either either a box that the company has installed for you. So for instance, like let's say I'm in an apartment, and because I'm in an apartment, my ISP actually already has a box set up in the house. So if you're not in an apartment, your ISP is not going to have a box set up in the house, and you're going to have to get a box. And this box is going to be it's going to be a modem. So this is kind of like the first thing you have to figure out. So to know if you're dealing with a modem or not, you're going to have to look and see if the connection going into the modem is, or going into your box, has like a pointy thing on the end. If it screws in and it's pointy, that means you're running a coax cable into your modem, and the coaxial cable is going to be your ISP's connection into your box. So for apartments, we don't have that most of the time because a lot of apartment complexes already have an ISP owned modem inside them. So for apartments, you're just going to have a Cat6 cable running into your router, and that's it. But for personal, you're going to have to actually buy your own modem. Sometimes you might get a modem router from your ISP, and then you'll be able to maybe connect. If you have a separate modem, you'll be able to run your modem. Uh, you'll be able to run an Ethernet cable from your modem to your router. But again, if you don't have a pointy cable to play with, that means that your ISP already did that for you, and you're just gonna have an Ethernet cable that goes to your router. So this is the basic setup. You have your modem goes into your router, and then your router is gonna give, like, it'll give Wi-Fi, or sometimes your router might have like other ports, and you'll have some Ethernet ports that you can connect to. But the big thing is deciding whether or not um, what router you're going to have, and if you even want a router right here in the first place. So you don't actually need a router right here, and I would recommend that you don't have a router right here. And the reason I'm going to recommend you don't have a router right here is because routers are really good at a lot of things, but what they're not great at most of the time is they don't have great security. Um, if they do have good security, it's probably going to be on the other end, as in like this router is going to have good security for preventing users from getting on the Wi-Fi. That's usually where the security is concerned with routers. They're not going to have great security coming from the internet service provider. And as you know, this internet service provider is actually connecting you to a much larger cloud called the internet. So if we could imagine, the ISP is just this little mini cloud that's connecting you to the internet. It's just giving you access to this giant bundle of chaos. So because we also want to protect this side, traditionally this router is just not good enough. So instead, we're gonna have something like a gateway. So this gateway can do a bunch of things. One, it can act as a there we go. This gateway can actually be a firewall, and if you get kind of like a device that's like specialized in being a firewall, you're gonna have like much more bang for your buck. And then once you have your gateway, then you can connect your gateway to your router. And you can actually go much deeper than this if you want to, but for consumers, I would say this is all that's necessary. And I mean, obviously, like a lot of people are probably not gonna do this anyway, so you don't really have to worry about going like too much crazier than this if you get a good gateway. So for gateways, I would recommend pfSense, and pfSense can be, pfSense is primarily a firewall, but you can use it as a gateway, which is why it's super good. So like let's say you have um, an old computer. You have this old desktop lying around. You don't have any use for it anymore. What you can do, most desktops don't actually have two Ethernet ports, but you can get a really cheap Ethernet port or network card from Amazon, or wherever you can find one, really. And you can install this second network card and Ethernet port onto your old desktop, and then you can download pfSense to a USB, a flash drive, and you can plug in the flash drive to the old desktop. And then depending on the operating system you're running on that desktop, you'll have to find out how to get to the BIOS menu. But once you get to the BIOS menu, you can say like, hey, desktop operating system, I want you to boot from. I guess it wouldn't be your desktop operating system. It'd be your motherboard. You tell your motherboard, hey, I want to boot from this USB instead. And once you do that, you can install this new pfSense operating system. And while pfSense will work for you probably out of the box for the most part, it's not nearly as friendly, I guess is the right word. So you need to be prepared to do some configuring. But if you're okay with that, that's really good, because it's a super powerful firewall that is, it's free. All you have to do is download it. So let's say you want to be a cool consumer and you want to get this open source firewall, and you're going to run your old desktop with a new network card. You're going to have to buy and install this second network card, but you're going to do that, and instead of running directly to a router, you're going to have this purpose-built firewall between you. So now we have something like this. We have this ISP giving us internet, or giving us access to the internet. Then we have our modem going into our firewall. our firewall is going to act as our gateway. So it's probably going to be something like probably something like this is going to be the IP address, and it's going to have two IP addresses, right? Because it's the gateway. So we'll have I'm just making this up, but you're going to have two IP addresses. You're going to have your public IP address, and you're going to have your private IP address. So if you didn't know, what your essentially what the ISP is doing for you, what your ISP is doing for you to grant you access to this massive server, or like massive cloud that is the internet, they're lending you one of their public IP addresses. So this public IP address is actually assigned by the ISP. You can influence it a little bit sometimes, depending on how flexible your ISP is. Sometimes you might be able to go into pfSense and be like, hey, I want to release this public IP and request for a new one. And sometimes that'll work. Sometimes pfSense can be like, yo, ISP, I want a new address. And the ISP is like, okay, well, I have this many addresses, so I guess I can give you one. And they'll give you a new address. But that doesn't always work. Also, your ISP doesn't have to tell you when they're giving you a new public IP address. So like if they're just, like recycling the addresses, you could get a new address, you wouldn't even know about it, you would just have a new address, and that's just how it works. So this address is kind of like up in the air, it's kind of hard to change, and that's kind of where, I don't know if anyone's heard of denial of service attacks, but that's why these denial of service attacks are sometimes kind of hard for consumers to protect against, because like you might have somebody just constantly getting your public IP address and attacking your network, and you say like, yo, ISP, this public IP address is no good, I'm getting attacked. And the ISP is like, well, like what did you do? Like why are you getting, because the ISP is getting attacked too, like this is their address. Like what the fuck did you do? And they're probably not too happy, you're not too happy, you're getting attacked, and they might not let you change it. Because if you change this address, basically it just causes problems for everyone. So, but that's why that's an issue, and that's why that exists. But this private address, this is your address, and this is not going to change. And the reason this address is different is because everything on here, let me draw a little. So this box, oh, it's annoying. This box is going to be your local. Oh, I see what it was. This is going to be your local network. Everything inside this box. So once it passes through your gateway and becomes local, all of this stuff is going to be, it's going to be your private IP address. So if you have some kind of like, let's say you have a laptop and you're like, got something there. Say you have your smartphone. And you have these connected to your Wi-Fi. And this router is going to be what's generating your Wi-Fi. So we can call this home Wi-Fi. So your router is going to be getting an IP address from your private address pool. So your router is probably going to have something like this. Because once you cross into this box, into this private box, all of these devices are going to be assigned private addresses. So this laptop is going to be maybe 192.168.1.3, and this phone is going to be 192.168.1.4. And there's basically two ways that this router can give out IP addresses. I guess there's a couple. So your router can give out an IP address from itself. So this router could be the DHCP server. So a DHCP server is something that gives out IPs. So you could either have the router in charge of giving out IPs, and the router is going to automatically know, because this gateway, if you're using a gateway, the gateway is going to have its own IP, and the router is going to know the gateway's IP, and it's going to be like, okay, I'm not going to use the gateway's IP. But it depends, right? Because if you're using, let's say you're using OpenWRT. OpenWRT is a router software that lets you configure basically, almost everything. It's extremely powerful, but an issue with OpenWRT is because it's so customizable, it will actually, it won't do everything for you, because that's kind of the point. So the issue that can happen is this, let's say you just launched an OpenWRT router. This OpenWRT router is going to be thinking like, hey, I'm the top dog, I'm number one. It's gonna give itself this first address, this 192.168.1.1. So you're gonna have to tell this router like, hey, you're not the top dog, you're actually, the top dog's lieutenant. And you're gonna have to tell the interface that it's getting the internet from. You're gonna have to tell that interface. So here, let me. That's not what I wanted to do. Oh man, this is gonna be slightly difficult. I think I can do it though. Okay. So this interface right here. So we have this interface is going to be the one on your computer, or the one on your pfSense gateway that you installed on your computer. And this interface is going to be the internet from the computer going into the router. And the router thinks it's top dog, but you're going to have to basically tell this interface like, hey, you're not top dog. You have to be in DHCP mode. You have to be receiving an IP address. So when you tell an interface to be in DHCP mode, it's going to wait until it gets an IP address assigned from it. And it's going to ask the connecting interface, hey, like, I need an IP address from you. And then this interface is going to be like, okay, like, look, I'll give you the next one. And the next address is going to be 192.168.1.2. So now that these interfaces have their addresses, I'll make this a little bit more clear. So this is going to be our private interface. This is our public interface. Once this router knows like, hey, I'm not top dog, I need to get this IP address from this other gateway, then this router can do a couple things. You can either have this router also support, it can also support the top dog in relaying, like saying, hey, smartphone, you can connect to me, but you need to get your IP address from this guy. And the smartphone will be like, okay, like, all right, well, route me. And then the router will be like, yeah, I can do that. And the router will route you to the DHCP server on this desktop. And then the DHCP server will be like, okay, here's your address. Or So you can either do it through pfSense or you can do it through the router. So this smartphone could be like, hey, I need an IP address, and if you're giving your router that responsibility, it can 100% do it. So if you do give your router that responsibility, what's going to happen is your router is going to be, it's going to have a DHCP server turned on. So, and it can do that, right? So your router can totally turn on a DHCP server and give out addresses to the devices that are connected via Wi-Fi. That's 100% a possibility. And it can do that while also getting a DHCP address from pfSense. But what this is going to do, so if you can imagine, it's going to be a little bit tricky to make. But basically what you're doing when you're giving your router permission to maintain its own private pool of addresses, you're actually making another box pretty much. So this box is controlled by pfSense, but by giving your router that much authority, you're actually saying like, hey, you can actually start a new address pool. So this router could actually, it could give out oh, I need to move this slightly up. Okay, here we go. So this is going to be our new box basically. And although this router is now giving out IPs on the home Wi-Fi, these addresses are not going to be like this. They might be something like this instead, like let's say 10.1.1.2 and 10.1.1.3. Obviously, like these addresses are going to depend on the interface. So let's say you have you keep this interface the same and it's running on 192.168.1.2, then these IPs might be like they were before. You might have this 1 and this dot 3 and this dot 4, but because they're inside this box, because you're giving your router the authority to be kind of independent of the larger box, this pfSense box is not actually going to know that these addresses are taken inside this pool. So, not to get more complicated, but basically if you had another router, let's say you have another router and it's right here, and this router is also, it's also receiving DHCP. Let's say it's it could be 192.168.1.3. It's not gonna know. It's not gonna know that this laptop is assigned to 192.168.1.3, and it's not gonna know because this router is gonna have its own box of private IP addresses. So it's really up to you how you want to do this and how you want to figure this out. There's a lot of flexibility. I personally, I would recommend not giving your router the authority to do all of this. And the only reason that I would not recommend that is because I like having one box. I like seeing all of these addresses on pfSense. I like knowing that they exist. I like knowing who's been on my network, and I don't want to have to so basically if you do have that other box, the only way to know which devices or which DHCP leases are being used is you're going to have to go onto your router and go to the leases and find out who's using your private IP addresses. So I prefer having pfSense do it because that way it's all in one place. There's a few other more complex things that you can do, but this is already pretty complex. You can do a lot with this because you have this firewall, this purpose-built firewall letting things into your network, and I don't know. There's a lot that you can stop with pfSense. You can get a whole bunch of different packages. So there's some packages that will they'll detect anomalies in like let's say connections. So by anomaly I mean like let's say I use I use Netflix at like 3 p.m. every day and I use it for 1 hour. But for some reason like pfSense, I guess Netflix isn't the greatest example, but for the sake of defining anomalies, we can use Netflix. So like let's say I like randomly on the network there's like a Netflix connection at 3 a.m. Like that's gonna raise a red flag because this pfSense package that detects anomalies is gonna be like, hey, there's an unusual connection going on at this time, and if the Netflix address is different too, maybe some of the protocols are different than what it's been seeing, that's also gonna raise some red flags. And depending on the amount of flags that are raised, this package that's part of pfSense might actually decide to block it. So that's kind of like an added benefit that you can have. There's really like a bunch of other things too. If you want to create your own VPN, your own remote VPN, you can do that on proprietary gateways as well. But I honestly don't think that they're going to work nearly as well. In my opinion, I really like OpenVPN, and I can make a video about how to set OpenVPN up too. It's not super complicated, but if you don't understand what's going into it, it can be complicated. But all of these things that I've talked about are things that you're going to have to decide when you're making your home network. And if you want to think about adding smart devices to your network, you're going to have to think about making it a little bit more complex because these smart devices they're just not smart. And the manufacturers that are making them, they just don't care about security. A lot of these devices that are being sold, they don't have they've so like let's say you have Windows 10. You have Windows 10. Windows 10 is supported, it gets rolling updates. It gets supported for like 20 years, right? 20 years. That's a long time. So during the lifespan of this Windows 10 operating system, you're going to have 20 years of security patches. If a new security flaw comes out on Windows 10, Microsoft is going to do its best to patch the security. And all of this might be taken for granted, but with an IoT device, a device that is honestly much more vulnerable than Windows in a lot of ways, you're going to have a patch or like a lifetime support of maybe like 6 months, if that. You honestly at this point, it's kind of like if you get any kind of firmware upgrade at all after buying the device, like if you get any kind of support whatsoever, you're kind of in a good spot because IoT devices just normally they just don't get support ever. So let's say there's this new IoT botnet that comes out and it's way worse than the last one, and there's this crazy vulnerability and everyone knows about it. These IoT devices are not getting a security update. That's just not going to happen. Maybe some devices might get an update, but the majority of them absolutely not. They do not care about that stuff. People are going to buy their products anyway. You already have Amazon Alexa literally listening to people, and that's like there are little jobs to listen to people through these devices. So I personally think that's kind of a breach of privacy. And I get, you can't have security and privacy at the same time, but you can get more privacy and more security by not using those devices and creating your own secure network. However, this setup, even just this, it's going to cost you time. It might not cost you a lot of money. OpenWRT is free. It does not work on every router, and pfSense is also free. It does not work on all hardware, but what this is going to cost you is time. And if you're willing to invest the time, this is going to be worth it, and you're going to learn a lot, and you're going to appreciate cybersecurity and kind of what people have to deal with. But if you don't want to do this, that's okay. If you do get something like an Amazon Alexa, for the most part, Amazon is gonna probably try to not to not screw you over. Um, but you know, while while they don't want people attacking your stuff, they're gonna be listening to you instead. So if you're okay with that, that's one thing to think about. But if you're not okay with that, there are solutions, and I'm not going to talk about them in this video just because this video is already 30 minutes long. But these are just kind of like some ideas or some concepts that you have to kind of consider when you're starting out. Um, yeah, so I think I'm going to end it there. I'll probably talk about Home Assistant. Home Assistant it's like an alternative to using Alexa or Google. So that's a great that works great with OpenWRT and pfSense because you don't have to these are open source too. So honestly, I'm kind of biased towards open source at this point just because other devices and other software has just not been pulling their weight, but that's just my experience, and I will leave you with your thoughts on what you want to do.